Welcome to the Radical Rhythm Podcast. This has been created for those of us that love radical women who live perhaps by the rules, but also question and challenge the status quo. We want more from our lives, to enjoy our sexuality, to explore radical thought, and to celebrate women who have lived and continue to live unconventional lives. Hi, I'm Dr. Toni Bear, sexologist, educator, activist, and definitely a radical woman. Thank you for joining me as I share stories of women challenging the status quo and living life to the fullest. Join me as we unapologetically march to the beat of a different drummer together. In this first episode, I'm honored to have Viola Johnson, leather woman, activist, and motivational speaker who has been active in the leather, kink, and fetish scene for well over 4 decades. Vi is a proud member of the Onyx Pearls and is one of the original Pearls of Onyx. She has received numerous honors for her work. Vi is the author of 2 books, Damn Fire, Child of the Blood, and To Love, To Obey, and To Serve. Vi has written for numerous magazines and newspapers over her decades of service to her tribe. Stay tuned and find out why Vi Johnson is the inspiration behind this podcast and why she will be an ongoing guest on this program. So today we have Vi Johnson with us, who is the founder and Senior Griot at the Carter Johnson Leather Library and Collection in Evansville, Indiana. I am thrilled to bring this woman who has been a mentor and a friend for me for so many years. And she truly is the inspiration for this podcast, Radical Rhythm, and has been a friend and someone who has walked to the beat of her own drum during her own lifetime as well. Vi, as you know, I spent some time at the library a couple months ago as your first visiting scholar. And at that time, I decided to take this Radical Rhythm podcast in a whole new direction. And one of the things that you told me was don't forget to put the spirit with the sexuality. And I was forgetting that. I was looking at this as a podcast of sharing information in a scholarly way with facts and concepts and theories, but I forgot about my heart. And I thank you for reminding me. So this whole broadcast is going to be a combination, this podcast, of sexuality and spirit together, featuring women who walk to the beat of their own drum. Vi, can you tell us a little bit, like when you hear marching to the beat of your own drum, it is a topic that you and I have talked about many, many times. What are your thoughts? What are your first thoughts about a program dedicated to women who walk to their own beat?
One, I think it's brilliant. Most of the women who have chosen to listen to the drumbeat of their heart rather than society don't usually get recognized until their deeds are analyzed by history long after they're gone. Spotlighting those women, in my opinion only, or as the kids would say, IMHO, gives more women the courage to do what their heart says do, rather than what society says they should do. Let's kill that one.
Is that a phone?
No, it's a weather report, actually.
Oh my goodness.
And that's what you're doing. You are giving women permission to follow their hearts. rather than follow someone else's belief that this is what they should do.
Well, you certainly followed your heart. And can I say obsession, perhaps, in starting the Carter Johnson Leather Library and Collection? Can you tell us a little bit about the collection? Because now it actually has a physical home.
That conversation alone could probably take hours, making an incredibly long story very short. A great German philosopher once said, if I can destroy your history, 2 generations later will never know you existed. Far too often, who we are is manipulated and told by everybody but us. And that's true for any subculture or minority culture. And it's told most of the time because they don't have proof of their past. They don't have the strength of the past and the honor of the past to stand on. Wouldn't a young gay youth be beaming with pride if he realized that Bernstein was gay? Or that half of the early writers were lesbians? Or that the woman who wrote My Country 'Tis of Thee was writing with her partner? Those facts are lost in history. Now, all I had to do was meet someone who was determined to burn it, to make me determined to save it. And essentially what started is my obsession, as you would put it, just to be able to show my own kinklings who they were and how they got here. Went from a few boxes to a storage unit to 2 storage units to a storage unit, my closet, my partner's closet, the garage, to now 2 buildings, because you don't get to destroy my kids' history. It's the fastest way to send them scurrying underground, believing the lies rather than the truth. So the library takes a little bit of everything. Courageous women's stories who blossomed while proclaiming their sexuality. Kink, fetishes, leather, things that I haven't even thought of yet. It took me forever to figure out what the hell yaoi was. But now the kids want it, there's yaoi in the collection. Anything that will show them that they are viable sexual and spiritual beings.
Well, one of the things that fascinated me about the physical library, I know most of us that are familiar with the Carter Johnson Leather Library and Collection are familiar with your mobile library, taking it on the road and taking it to events and making it accessible to so many different folks. And now we have these buildings, and it's so many different rooms with so many different ideas. My first couple podcasts uh, were absolutely, in fact, all my podcasts are going to be inspired by what I found in the library. It might be the beginning of a topic that I research outside of the library, but it started in the library. For example, one of your 2 buildings is a sex center. And I read about women in the 1970s, which led me to fantasies and those women who fulfilled their fantasies, and why did other women not fulfill their fantasies.
Yeah.
So the research in the sex center started the topic for this second podcast. The third podcast is about Aphrodite. And you would think I'm studying just about goddesses, but it actually came from your rare book room, where I found a book called Aphrodite by a 19th century French heterosexual man.
Yes.
And it was all about lesbian relationships and lesbian sex and much, much more, which you have to tune into the third podcast to find out, right? Um, there are so many different rooms with so many different resources. Um, do you want to just tell us what all the different rooms are? I know that we're going to talk about women in a minute here, but there's just so many different types of resources that you have available for someone who might visit.
Now, since you started in the center, let's start there. The story of the Center for Sex and Culture and how it happened um, is a whole different topic. But in the center is its main room, a kind of reading and gaming room that is dedicated to one of this tribe's greatest photographers, and that's a man named Efrain Gonzalez. And Ephraim's story is also a topic for another conversation. And then last but not least, a room that is very close to my heart, which is the bedroom for a young scholar. Not, yes, we were chartered to travel. That is what we do. We bring history to the community we serve. But as I found out very early on, the 2 or 3 days we can be at any one location doesn't always give someone who is not just reading and learning, but doing serious work, time to research. So I wanted to create a place where a young scholar could come and literally lock himself in with the books and have a good time for anywhere from 2 or 3 days to 3 or 4 months, if that's what it took. That's one building. That's the one that's a little more family friendly, I might add. Moving next door is our kinkier side, our more leather and fetish side. And we begin in the basic reading room, which is the entrance to the library, dedicated to a wonderful woman who was like a sister to me. And it's simply called My Sister's Reading Room. Rather than a kitchen in that building, it's a media room for us, dedicated to the person who keeps all of our media going, which is Pulse Tinsley. But it's a small space where we can show movies to a group of maybe 15 or so. Extra computers, a place where people can come and copy things that they need for programs. The largest room in the back is actually for our magazine collection, which is pretty extensive and growing. Not just the full runs of modern things like the Leather Journal or On Our Backs, but magazines going back to the 20s, 30s, and 40s as we find them and collect them and preserve them. Our art room is dedicated to an old friend, Dr. Gail Rubin. And the library's art collection is pretty decent and ever growing. A lot of posters, because posters tell the history of this tribe, as well as a movie poster collection that most people don't think about. Some of those images on the old posters, especially the blue posters of the 70s and 80s, are pretty vibrant. And they're really kind of pretty. And then there is the place where you are most likely to find me curled up in my favorite chair, and that's the library's rare book room. The tomes that are there go back to, well, our oldest is the 1703 History of the Rod, or technically it's the Histoire de la Flagellants. And complete press runs of a lot of the early publishers. But most of the things that are in that room are there either because of their age or because they are numbered tomes. They are number 127 of 1500, number 2 of 100, and so on. The books that we are fighting the most to find and to save, because they were limited press runs when they came out. They're more scarce now because based on their age, half of them no longer exist. So finding number 580 of 1,000 ever printed and guaranteeing that it's there for some young scholar to pick up. Because as I often joke with those who come in, this is not a museum, it's a library. If you don't pick it up and hold it, you have no relationship with it. And my books get pissy if you don't love up on them. Now, that doesn't count what's here in my workroom, what's in my garage, what's upstairs on my bookshelf, and which is all technically part of the library. And it's hard to believe I'm in 2 buildings and I'm already out of space.
Right, right. And it's I was lucky enough to stay in that scholar's bedroom and spend a month at the library in the fall of 2020. And that's where I fell in love with Aphrodite. And that's where I I received the inspiration to write a course and to start a community, was in that rare book room as I felt that the wisdom of the ages was telling me that, I need to share this wonderful information with the world. And, you know, I wanted to ask you, there there's so many resources, and I know that I have enough content to share from the library for a lifetime. But if you had to choose a few women, and I know this is a difficult question, that you think we should feature in this podcast of women that march to the beat of their own drum, can you mention a few you think should be featured in later broadcasts?
Wow. Uh, okay, we're crossing about 19 out of my mind right off the bat. The first one would be a woman you and I had talked about briefly, a woman named Lillian Harmon Walker. She doesn't get the credit she deserves for being with her father at the root of the Kansas anarchist movement and the free sex movement that started in the late 1800s, something a lot of people don't know about. Michelle Peters would be another. In the 60s, Michelle came out as a transgender woman and a professional dominatrix. She was probably one of the most photographed women of her age, with a story that, as a story, I think needs to be told. Ooh, uh, Betty Dodson, recently deceased. Betty's story was just amazing, and I was proud to call Betty a friend. Barbara Nicky. I mean, yes, she's a well-known photographer, so is her husband. Nicky dared to stand up to the Supreme Court of the United States in a case of Nicky versus Ashcroft. Barbara's story needs to be told. There are so many. Mistress Antoinette from California, who opened one of the first sex boutiques and boutiques for women who wanted to dress for fetish. And those are just the ones right off the top of my head.
Yeah, I mean, I came home back to Pennsylvania with a pile of books you let me borrow, and it's almost an obsession that's contagious. Because from that moment on, I needed a copy of X, Y, and Z, and I started looking myself for collections related, to different topics of interest relating around women's sexuality. And I had one great big bookcase, and now it's tripled. There's three in a row that feature sexuality in my house. And mind you, I'm a professor with two offices at the university that have walls of books that I own about history, race, and culture. So, speaking of race, history, and culture, I surveyed the women in my community called Voyages of Aphrodite, and I asked them what do they want to hear on this podcast. I thought let's
Mhm.
throw out a poll, and they chose over women's politics, women's culture, um, even sex, sexuality. They chose women who march to the beat of their own drum as the number one topic they wanted to hear about. So that's why I ask you, Vi, who would you suggest, right? And places to start, because there is a lifetime of information just in the library. But to let everyone know, Vi and I together brainstormed a list of women a couple months ago that I should interview. And I started on this journey where I spend about 3 nights a week interviewing women who marched to the beat of their own drum in the 1970s and 80s
Yeah.
that are everyday women that you've never heard of, who
Yes.
have amazing stories. And that's where I'm doing most of my research now. But we've also talked, Vi, about young women today who have phenomenal stories, who march to the beat of their own drum. And you have a conference coming up, and you have some of those topics and young folks speaking their truth
Yeah.
of voices seldom heard. What kind of topics are going to be in your conference coming up?
Well, I think I once told you I'm getting tired of the standard things that come up in leather conferences, mostly because it's done by the old dogs. We're not making a seat at the table for our next generation. So maybe it's time to make an additional table. And so I listened. What are you talking about? And what will you teach grandmom? Because it's not my world, but I do want to learn. I watched my kids playing in a game called Animal Crossing. When I got over the initial shock and stopped laughing, I realized they were having dates in this game. They were having virtual dates. They had set up dungeons. So one of my presenters is talking about Animal Crossing. Another is talking about what it is we do in Second Life. A third presenter is exploring what it means to be a little with a panel of littles, not how they play, the technical side, what's in your head, and talking, hopefully, to allow other littles to come out and say, this is a part of me, and empower them to do just that. Another of my presenters is exploring a topic I'm eager to hear, which is music in the scene. Not just how it can set a scene, but how it can either heighten and excite or alleviate fears. I'm all up in that one and really curious. We
I'm
have
so excited. It's what, February 27th on
27th,
Saturday?
brand new topics, topics that usually aren't given voice. That's the purpose of the conference.
Well, I will make sure I put the link underneath this video because we're going to do this via video. The podcast itself, recording, might come out before your conference. It might not, but this will definitely be up on YouTube right away tonight, actually. And
Cool.
and I'll put the link there for folks to hit if they're interested in coming to a conference and listening to voices seldom heard. I had one more question for you today, Vi. When I traveled to the library at the very beginning of October, I have a position at the university. I still have that position, but I'm about to retire. And I am known as a scholar activist. That's what I've always been called. My colleagues say that, uh, Tony is the professor of get shit done. That's what they call me, right? Which I guess is not a bad thing. I really think it's important that research doesn't stay as research and written in a journal for a few people to read. I believe it should be accessible to the
Here,
masses, right? And in that, and I know that's why the library was mobile, and continues to be mobile, and that's part of your mission. But something happened to me when I was at the library. There were a couple things, and they could be stories all onto their own. I have a new friend. His name is QB. It was a gift from Vi, and she knows that I'm petrified of snakes. And now this is my new friend. That's actually a whip, and he is actually in. There's the end of the whip. Um, an interesting gift. And then following my new friend and I, and I'll put him off to the side as not to distract folks who are watching this, um, I felt that it was the beginning or middle or part of a transformation in myself. And my new Cobra friend is symbolic and walks alongside me in this transition. I feel as though I entered as a scholar in October and I might have left as a griot. Can you talk a little bit about what a griot is? Um, and then I'll conclude the program today with how this podcast might be of that tradition.
Uh, by the way, was that deliberate? No comment. Most of us understand the role of the storyteller. It goes back, it's tribal. It is as much a part of people as our history is, gathering around the tribal fire and hearing stories or waiting for the storyteller to come. We understand the word storyteller, but there is a difference. In West Africa, the term isn't storyteller, it's griot. Now, a griot not only tells stories, but a griot is responsible for tribal history. Not just remembering the stories of the tribe, but remembering the lineage and making that exciting because it's personal. The difference between that scholar that you came in as and the griot is this is now personal for you. You're not, and no harm, no foul, you're not making exciting the history of the past in the words of other scholars, because that's what teachers do, that's what professors do. You're making it exciting because it's a part of you now. And you're weaving your own story into that history and telling that history from a personal perspective. It isn't a history class, it's a series of personal stories. And people listen to the story, especially when they can see pieces of their own going through it. That's when it gets exciting. So the scholars become a griot.
Yes, yes. So the Radical Rhythm podcast is not going to be research per se. It'll be sharing research and sharing some of what I've read and studied about Aphrodite, for example. But the focus of the podcast is going to be in the stories that I tell that are related to these different through lines that go through the topic. And for that, and for so many things, Vi, I am so grateful to you, and I am thrilled that you were a guest, the first guest to this podcast, because it was only fitting that that we start here.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being with us today. Again, the link for the Carter Johnson Leather Library and Collection is below. You can check out their collection and also their conference below. And thank you so much for listening today. And, don't let anyone dim your shine, and make sure to move forward in life in your passion, your vibrance, and your joy in your sexuality and spirit.
To your viewers and listeners, see you in the library.
Thank you so much for tuning in today. Be sure to check out the first Carter Johnson Library and Collection conference entitled The Circle, Voices Seldom Heard. Links to the conference are in the text below. The Dr. Toni Bear programs that I mentioned in this broadcast, the Voyagers Club Inner Circle and Aphrodite's Secrets course, can be found on my website, www.tonibearedd.com. I appreciate you listening. Drop a comment below. I love to read your comments about the episode. Our next episode will feature women's top 10 sexual fantasies. It's a show you certainly don't want to miss.